Hi, I'm Audrey Gamble. I'm a soil scientist with Auburn University and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System.
And I'm Dennis Delaney, retired extension professor with the Department of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Sciences at Auburn University.
And today we're out at the Cullars Rotation behind Jewel Collins Museum of Art in Auburn. We're at an experiment. This experiment was established in 1911 by Professor George Atkinson. It was one of 200 experiments in the state at the time to evaluate how different crops responded to different soil fertility treatments.
Yeah, when this experiment was started back in 1911, a lot of the cotton across the state of Alabama, across the southeast, had been in continuous cotton since before 1860 or so. And continuous cotton hadn't had a lot of nutrients added. Had been, conventional tillage, a whole lot of things going on to it. And they noticed that they developed a severe problem called cotton rust, and they didn't know what it was. They knew it was some sort of disease, or at least a disease caused the leaves to fall off about the time the cotton bolls began to fill out. And of course, without any leaves, there's nothing to fill out the cotton bolls, and yield really suffered. So since cotton was the main cash crop for these farmers, it was pretty severe. So Dr. Atkinson put in, it was altogether about 14 treatments out here in a 3-year rotation. There were 11 to start with, 3 were added on just a couple years after it started. But again, going back to 1911, identical treatments, identical plots, and in a 3-year rotation. But basically there are 5 crops being grown out here within 3 years. Every year each plot rotates to another crop. In the 4th year it'll be back to the same again. It'll be cotton, followed by a legume, which is followed by a corn crop, which is followed in the fall by a small grain crop, which is lately has been a wheat. At one time probably was rye or oats or something like that. And then as soon as that small grain is harvested in about June or so, we come back in and we plant a summer legume. Since about 1940 or so, that's been soybeans. Before then, it was southern peas. Usually they're grown as a forage crop. So again, in the course of 3 years, the 3 rotation, 5 crops are being grown out here. And we have to try to time those as best as we can. We try to use modern farming practices, the same as progressive farmers across the state use, to try to keep it relevant for them, for the results. Modern cotton varieties, we look at variety trials each year. They are genetically modified, BT resistant to glyphosate and so on. The same with soybeans. We look at the best varieties for those, and corn and small grains. So again, we try to reflect what farmers are doing and try to make sure that any results we get from here are going to be relevant to what they're doing. In 1996, from 1911 to 1995, all this soil was work using conventional tillage. It's the same as farmers used to ever since 1911. It'd be plowed in the fall if it didn't have a cover crop on it. Plowed in the fall, kept bare, disc, and so on. If it had a cover crop, it'd be plowed under in the spring, disc, smooth the soil, make it real fluffy, and then plant into it. But in 1996, with the help of the USDA National Tillage Dynamics Lab here on campus, we went to conservation tillage, or no-till. So the only tillage that this soil has had out here since 1996 is we've learned we have to subsoil in the row, which is only about 2 inches wide, right where the seed is going to be dropped and the roots are going to grow. So we'll come about 2 weeks before planting, run the in-row subsoiler, kind of let it settle a little bit, and then plant our corn and cotton into it. But other than that, there hasn't been any tillage out here ever since 1996, and yields have kind of reflected that.
Okay, so right now we're standing in one of our plots in the Cullars Rotation. This is currently in cotton, and this is a plot that receives full fertility. So it gets all the the macronutrients that are required for optimum plant growth according to soil test, and then it also gets some micronutrients that we recommend for cotton, like boron. So this plot, it yielded about 1,000 pounds of lint per acre last year. So we can see some pretty good overall green growth in this plot. The cotton looks good, full of bolls, and I want to walk down and show some plots that have had some different fertility treatments omitted over the years. So first we'll stop at this plot, which has not received any lime since 1911. So the soil pH here is about 4.5. So for most of our crops, including cotton, our ideal pH range is between 6 and 6.5. So you can see what this cotton looks like when that pH is so low that not only are our nutrients not available, but we're also can see some signs of aluminum toxicity within these plots as well, because the pH is so low. So overall, these plots are stunted. There's several plants that just haven't come up. And this particular plot last year did not yield any cotton whatsoever. So we harvested no lint from this plot last year. Okay, here we get to a plot that has never received any potassium since 1911. So one of the characteristics of potassium deficiency is that we start to see some yellowing around the leaf edges. You can see in this leaf here some yellowing around the edges, as well as some interveinal chlorosis or overall yellowing of that leaf. And another symptom of potassium deficiency is increased incidence of disease. So like Dr. Delaney mentioned, in this spot it was first discovered that cotton rust was linked with potassium deficiency. There's also some leaf spot diseases that are linked with potassium deficiency. So being deficient in potassium just really decreases the overall health of the plant and leaves it susceptible for some of those diseases to come in. And just like the plot that did not have any lime, this plot last year did not yield any cotton lint that was harvestable. And I want to walk over and show the same deficiency symptoms on soybean. Soybean isn't quite as susceptible to potassium deficiency as cotton, but again, you can see this characteristic yellowing along the leaf edges, and this does result in decreased soybean yields in these plots. So now we're in a plot that's never received any phosphorus. We can see some of the characteristic deficiency symptoms of phosphorus deficiency, which includes this reddening or purpling around the leaf edges, seen here. Phosphorus, it can lead to overall stunting of the plant as well. So we can see that typically these plants are shorter than the others. This is true for our cotton plots and our soybean plots, as well as our corn. And so again, these do suffer in terms of yield because of this phosphorus deficiency. Okay, so now we're standing in a plot which has never received nitrogen. Nitrogen deficiency can be observed on a plant by seeing some overall yellowing of the leaf tissue, and we also see stunted plants. Nitrogen is very important for chlorophyll production, so that's why we see that overall yellowing of the plant. We do suffer a yield reduction of several hundred pounds per acre in these plots that don't receive nitrogen. But we don't see that in our soybean plants, and that's because soybean is a legume and it fixes its own nitrogen from the atmosphere. So even in these plots that have not received nitrogen, we still see excellent yields in soybean. I've dug up a soybean root here, and we can see some nodules here on the root. These nodules are full of rhizobium. That's a soil bacteria that takes nitrogen from the atmosphere, and it converts it into plant available forms so that this soybean root, so that the soybean plant can have adequate nitrogen for growth. And we see the same thing in our crimson clover plots when we have them out here in the winter.
So I'm Audrey Gamble, and I'm a soil scientist at Auburn University and with the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Now that we've done a tour of the Cullars Rotation, I want to go in a little bit more depth about potassium fertility. So potassium fertility was a big issue for cotton producers when the Cullars Rotation was established 100 years ago, and it continues to be an issue which cotton producers face today. We frequently see potassium deficiency show up mid-season throughout the Southeast and the Cotton Belt. As shown at the Cullars Rotation, deficiency symptoms first appear as yellowing along the leaf edges or leaf margins, and as symptoms progress over time, we may start to see more diseases come in, leaf spots, and an overall kind of bronzing of that cotton. And back in the early 1900s, producers referred to this as cotton rust, even though it wasn't necessarily an actual rust disease. It was the appearance of those diseases coming in, the potassium deficiency. That was kind of a secondary result of the potassium deficiency. And so on this graph, you can see how soil test potassium can affect yields at the Cullars rotation. These are results from the previous year, and plots which receive no potassium fertilizer for the past 100 years, we actually do not produce any harvestable lint. So any potassium which naturally was present in that soil has been mined over time. When potassium is applied at 1/3 the correct soil test potassium rate, we are able to produce a few hundred pounds of lint each year on those plots. At the 2/3 rate, the lint yield nearly doubles, and at the full K rate, we see the lint yield over triple in this particular year, which is pretty common. And then at the 4/3 potassium rate, we don't see any yield benefits. So this is a pretty straightforward result. And if we apply K according to soil test, we maximize yields. And when we apply above those levels, we don't see any additional benefits. However, results are not always this straightforward in the field. Producers often observe potassium deficiency even when soil test potassium is maintained. And there are several reasons that this can occur. But first, let's talk about cotton varieties. Today, we have cotton varieties which have much higher yield potentials than those produced 100, 50, or even 10 years ago. And with higher yielding varieties, we would expect that demand for potassium by the plant would increase. So we have established experiments throughout Alabama at locations including the Wiregrass Research Station and Gulf Coast Research Station to test whether newer, higher yielding varieties have a higher demand for potassium. And in our 2018 and 2019 results, we have 8 site years for these experiments. And we tested potassium rates from 0 to 240 pounds per acre. So we actually had 8 rates that were being tested. And we typically saw results like this. So in this graph, you can see that we have lint yield according to potassium rate. And you essentially see a flat line. So as long as initial soil test K was close to or right at current recommended soil test levels, we did not see a response to additional applied fertilizer. So 7 out of 8 times we saw this exact same trend. The only exception was at one of our central Alabama locations in 2018, where we saw that soil test reports called for 60 pounds of potassium, and we continued to see an increase in lint yield up to 90 pounds of potassium per acre. So despite having a high yield potential and often producing above 3 bales of cotton, we did not see that additional potassium helped to improve lint yields. So currently, we do not have enough evidence to show that Auburn recommendations for potassium need to be updated for newer, higher yielding varieties. But we'll continue to evaluate these in 2020 as our results are currently being harvested, our plots are currently being harvested. But let's take a look at some of the other factors that may influence potassium deficiency. So there's several other factors that can lead to potassium deficiency even when soil test potassium is sufficient. And the first one that I want to discuss is soil moisture. So potassium is taken up by the plant from the soil by 2 different methods: mass flow and diffusion. And both of these processes require adequate soil moisture to take place. And in dryland systems, this can be very difficult since we can't control the weather. We don't know when it's going to rain. But there are some overall management practices that we can use to aid in soil moisture storage. So for example, planting of high biomass cover crops and terminating cover crops prior to cotton planting can provide a thick mat of residue on the soil surface that can help water infiltrate more efficiently and also help that water be stored for longer periods of time. So if you think about the pine straw or mulch in your garden, that's going to regulate soil temperature and help prevent evaporation of soil moisture, just like that cover crop residue will. And so for all of you Floridians, I know that Dr. Mike Mulvaney has also done some research within the Florida Panhandle showing the benefits of cover crops for conserving soil moisture. Another common cause of potassium deficiency is soil compaction. So I have here a photo that was taken by Eddie McGriff, one of our Alabama regional extension agents. And here you can see J-rooting of cotton. So that cotton root has gone down, it's hit a hard pan and started to grow horizontally. So it's always a good idea to scout not only what's going on above ground in your cotton fields, but also what's going on below ground. So digging up, taking a shovel out into the field, digging up roots and seeing, are we seeing a compaction issue, can help us examine whether this is a problem. Because hard pans can prevent those roots from exploring deeper into the soil profile to pull up nutrients that can be used for cotton growth. When a problem like this is observed, subsoiling or some kind of non-inversion conservation tillage is an excellent option. This allows that hard pan to be broken up without disturbing the soil structure and breaking up organic matter in the soil. So another cause of potassium deficiency when soil test potassium appears deficient is field variability. And I emphasize the word appear here because in this case it may be that the soil sampling strategy that was used has not adequately assessed current soil test potassium levels in the field. So here I have shown a satellite image of a cotton field that was taken from a UGA extension publication showing variability in cotton growth throughout a field. There's a number of reasons that we see variability, but one of those can be nutrient content changing throughout a field. So it's important to use a soil sampling strategy that addresses this issue. So in the schematics that I've shown here, there are two different common soil testing methods that account for field variability. The image on the left shows a grid sampling method which divides the field into equal parts prior to sampling, and soil samples are collected within each grid. And the right image shows the field divided into zones for sampling, and these zones can be determined with data from NRCS Web Soil Survey data. They can be based off of previous results from yield maps and things like that. And it really just helps producers to address where they need to be putting out potassium on their field. So both of these examples, the yield maps or grid sampling has helped to assess and address some of the variability within cotton fields, but zone sampling is able to do it with fewer soil samples. And my last comment related to this issue is to not have or hire a lazy soil sampler, because it's really hard, to maintain a lot of enthusiasm as you're taking soil samples throughout the day. For example, if you've got a large field that's on a grid sample, you may want to start taking fewer and fewer samples throughout the day, but really we're addressing, a large scale variability with these few soil samples, and we really need to make sure that they're representative of our field in order to correctly maintain our nutrients. And so the correct number of samples needs to be collected to the correct depth. So for example, if you're using a grid sampling technique, it's advised to take about 10 to 15 subsamples for each grid to make one soil sample per grid location. So it's a lot of work, but it pays off if you have someone who is doing a thorough job of collecting the soil samples. Another frequently reported cause of potassium deficiency is depletion of subsoil potassium. So when crops are grown year after year in the same location, there is some concern that lack of potassium in the subsoil can lead to potassium deficiency. However, a recent research project that took place in several locations throughout the Southeast and was sponsored by Cotton Incorporated has shown that cotton yields were not increased when potassium fertilizer was placed deep within the soil profile. So broadcast application of potassium still appears to be the best method for potassium application. The last cause of potassium deficiency that I want to discuss today is just having a heavy boll load and high production potential. And this is a good problem to have. Again, with our newer, higher yielding varieties that are producing more bolls and higher yields in a shorter fruiting period, cotton plants have become more efficient at using potassium. But the cotton roots may simply not be able to keep up with enough potassium uptake to achieve their full yield potential. So this can explain why yields do not increase when higher levels of potassium fertilizer are applied to the soil. So this often brings up the question, can we supply cotton through foliar applications of potassium? The problem with foliar potassium is that we are only able to put out about 4 pounds of potassium per acre with a given application. And at peak bloom, mid bloom, those cotton plants are going to be taking up above 3 pounds of potassium per day. So it's simply just hard to keep up with this demand through foliar applications. We have not seen improved yields with foliar applications of potassium in our Alabama research plots, as shown in this graph. But when surveying research across the Southeast, occasionally there is a research trial that will show a slightly improved yield with additional foliar potassium, but applications are still typically not economical. So in summary, the best methods to reduce likelihood of potassium deficiency are first to ensure a sound soil testing program that adequately addresses field variability of soil potassium within the field, and second, to use soil management practices which promote reduced compaction and improved soil moisture. So cover crops with a high biomass are a great method to conserve soil moisture, and dryland systems to promote nutrient uptake, and conservation tillage methods like subsoiling can help combat compaction issues.